Thanks for watching another Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and on the program is Ellen Cantarow. Ellen is a journalist who's been writing about environmental issues and climate change related to the oil and gas industry, and she recently interviewed Louis W. Allstadt. He's a former executive of Mobil about the environmental dangers of hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as it's called now, as it relates to the extraction of oil and gas. And that interview was posted on Truthout. Hi, Ellen. Thanks for being on the program.
Hi, Ted. It's a pleasure.
So before we get into some of the nitty-gritty questions, curious on how you came to writing about environmental issues in the first place.
Well, I had been interested in climate change ever since a discussion of it began on a national level, but from the late 70s through around 2004 or 5, I was writing about Israel and Palestine and other issues. And so I didn't really get into this until a few years ago. And when I did, I realized that there were people who had been writing about climate change itself for 25 years, Bill McKibben and Tim Flannery and other highly qualified people. And so what began falling in my lap was stories about oil spills and other, what I would call other depredations, other disasters wreaked by big oil and big gas corporations on the environment. And then somebody told me that there was a really interesting movement that crossed lines of class and social background, and that it was happening in New York State. And so I wrote my first article on fracking about the resistance to high-volume hydraulic fracturing in New York State, and it went on from there. So it's a big industry. There's no end of stories about it. I and other people write about it, and that's how I got into it.
Well, it seems like I read your interview with Louis Allstadt, and it seems like we're at a tipping point with regards to consumption and production of oil and gas worldwide. Now, demand is higher worldwide, but the resources are becoming smaller and smaller and limited. And Louis Allstadt calls this the race for what's left. So where is this race taking place?
Actually, let me backtrack just a little bit and say that The Race for What's Left is the title of a book by Michael Clare, Klare, and anybody who's interested in the energy industry should read Michael Clare's work because he's a really great oil industry scholar. What he discusses is the moment we're at when conventionally accessible gas and oil are on the decline, and big energy corporations like ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, and others are going to previously inaccessible places by using technologies that have been recently developed, enabling them to access these sources. The problem is that the technologies that have been developed to access these sources and the process of exploitation are incomparably dangerous to the planet. So we began by talking about that, and I asked him what constituted the dangers of this industry. And he backtracked and reviewed what conventional access had meant and now what unconventional access means.
No, he was very clear in how it's changed and the way in which they've been extracting oil since they started extracting oil from the ground has changed in decades since they've been doing that. But he also talked a little bit about the energy crises of the 70s and 80s and how the oil and gas industry was trying to develop a little bit of alternative energies, but that kind of didn't pan out the way that we had all hoped it would.
Right. I asked him whether big oil and gas corporations had tried to develop alternative energies, and he said that they had they had experimented with solar power, and they had experimented with, I think, wind, maybe not so much wind as solar, but it wasn't profitable. So they abandoned it. And what everybody who's listening to this knows, which is that Europe is far ahead of us in developing alternative energies. And so what it needs is it needs a government push for that development. While there are multiple dangers from high-volume hydraulic fracturing, the greatest danger that he sees is to the climate. And what I found so striking about this interview, and the reason I wanted to get it out on Truthout, is because Louis Allstadt he was one of the highest ranking executives of Mobil Oil Corporation. And so, I mean, he was in charge of production and exploration for oil in Asia and in the Western Hemisphere. He was in charge of marketing. I mean, this is a guy who really knows the industry. When he says that high-volume hydraulic fracturing is of greatest danger because of its impact on the climate, people have to sit up and take notice. And I think the article did get a lot of attention.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you talked a little bit about an international movement, and that government needs a push. In Europe, they're much more advanced than we are in terms of alternative energies, although they are pretty much wedded to nuclear energy too, in certain countries. But Allstadt went to a town meeting where there was standing room only because there was a lot of concern about hydraulic fracturing or fracking, and it seems like if it's in someone's backyard and on a local level, that you can get people out, and there could be a smaller movement in terms of opposition to the oil and gas industry. But on a national and international level, you've got a very entrenched industry that has lobbying throughout state, local, federal, even international governments that can push their agenda. What do you think it's going to take for a larger scale movement? I mean, we had a huge environmental disaster with the BP oil spill, but what do you think, as far as the country is concerned, domestically in the United States, what will it take for that to happen?
That it will take conventions, a lot of cross-state, interstate meetings. I don't think it's impossible, and also I think that when it comes to the power of corporations, we often tend to be pessimistic, but the anti-fracking movement has already had a big impact. I mean, there's a lot of pushback from the industry. They are really sitting up and taking notice, and they're striking back. Well, they wouldn't be doing that if the movement had not had an impact, and if high-volume hydraulic fracturing had not been getting a dirty name both in the press, and there's a lot of distrust of it. And I think that's all part of the raising of consciousness that is necessary for any movement to spread. But can I point something out?
Sure.
What we're talking about is something called high volume hydraulic fracturing. Rock fracture is something that has, and the industry says this, it seizes on the term fracking and says, well, we've been doing this for 60 years and it's never caused any harm. And what Allstadt points out, and also an engineering professor at Cornell University named Anthony Ingrafia, this is a very, very different kind of industry from the original fracking industry because it uses huge volumes of water, chemicals, sand, and a different drilling technique from the earlier drilling technique. And it's invasive on an enormous scale. This is a huge industry. It's not just the drilling. It's the thousands of miles of pipelines. It's the compressor stations that compress the gas for transport. A along the pipelines. And I'm about to write a story for Truthout about a compressor station in a place called Minisink in New York, where people are getting sick because there's this gas compression machinery, a machine called a compressor station in their midst, which is spewing out environmental toxins, environmental and human toxins. So when you think about high volume hydraulic fracturing, you have to consider that you're thinking about everything that happens before and after the actual drilling takes place. The actual drilling itself is just a moment in the life of the industry. And all of your listeners will, if they do a little digging, they'll find that there are pipelines that may be going through their states. You have to carry this stuff somewhere. So there are pipelines being carried to termini on the coasts because the end destination for fracked gas is not in the United States, where the industry tried to persuade people that it would be, but it's being sold to Europe, it's being sold in Asia. So the United States is actually being made a resource colony, like another Nigeria.
The release of the methane gas when this fracturing occurs is something that can deteriorate or at least lead to trapped greenhouse gas, which can lead to global warming and more extreme climate events, climate change, severe droughts, more severe flooding, and a change of our environment to the point that it's not habitable. And so you did say that it's a very invasive process that is fraught with its own environmental dangers. In the process of drilling, the compressor releases its own toxins into the air, and once an oil well is found, methane gas will rise to the surface. Even if it's capped, the rock could be porous enough that it could come through the rock and through the ground.
That's the start. And then the accidental fissures that are created when you drill down in high volume hydraulic fracturing, it's not just down, it's outward laterally for a mile or two. And for each well pad, there are multiple wells. That was not true of conventional drilling. And the bores into which water and chemicals are pumped to force the methane out are, if you picture them like spokes of a wheel, and then you picture a large area like a grid on which there are multiple drill pads for miles square, and then you consider that pipelines are then constructed to take the gas to other states. The compressor stations that's machinery for compressing the gas to go into pipelines. But the methane release does not happen so much in the drilling as it does after the drilling takes place on the outsides of the pipe casements, and then as the pipe casings decay, but also through the accidental fissures that are created in the rock fracture, and also along those thousands of miles of pipelines. You can't seal up, you can't guarantee thousands of miles of pipelines against these leaks. They are inevitable, and industry sources, including Lou Allstadt, acknowledge that.
It's a fascinating piece, an interview. I mean, it's very revealing. I think that if you haven't read it, that I'm talking to the Truthout readers, definitely get a chance to read this interview, and it will lead you to other sources, not only how the industry works in terms of hydraulic fracturing, but the environmental consequences of it. I want to thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you so much, Ted. My pleasure.
All right, read Ellen's interview, like I said, with Louis Allstadt on Truthout, and subscribe to this channel. We do these videos usually about once a week, sometimes every other week. Thanks for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo. We'll see you next time.